Salvete discipuli de Romano Historia Militari, and g'day from Australia. Let's just get into it. Why did Rome fall? This is the million-dollar question, and I've found YouTube to be brimming with answers. Leaving aside matters of definition, such as whether or not Rome really fell, or whether the continued survival of the Eastern Empire meant that the empire merely contracted, we see that the usual explanations for Rome's fall go something like this. The Roman army was defeated at Adrianople and the Goths ran amok. The Romans started using disloyal barbarians as soldiers and weakened the army. The Roman government was corrupt, there were too many orgies, there were not enough slaves, the emperors were weak. Rome got sacked, there were too many Huns and there was too much Christianity, not enough ancient virtues of courage and discipline. The Roman legions declined and weren't effective anymore, etc. But wait, there are flip sides to all of these issues. Let's look at a few of them again for just a moment. The barbarianisation of the army. The disloyalty of barbarian troops has been overstated. There are outstanding examples of ex-foederati going rogue, the Goths being the most prominent example, but the enormous manpower requirements of the late Roman army could not be met through citizen recruits, despite legislation, no doubt seldom applied, such as that prescribing immolation for malingering army recruits. The recruitment of barbarian warriors, the foederati, as mercenaries provided the manpower that the Roman Empire needed to fight against ever-worsening odds. In most cases, as long as they were paid, they served loyally. In this regard, they were much like non-barbarian soldiers. Without them, the empire probably would not have survived as long as it did. What about the corruption of the Roman government? This was absolutely a problem, and it created grave inefficiencies in the Roman tax system. Even the remarkably well-organised government of Justinian in the mid-6th century AD had great trouble with this issue, and stamping it out was probably beyond the state's capabilities. What about not enough slaves? This was, no doubt, a long-term weakness in the Roman economy, but not one that was critical in any way to the state's survival. Too many orgies. Well, as I think any modern series on Rome or anything on Caligula will make clear, it's that orgies and Roman military power did not necessarily inversely correlate. What about the sacking of Rome? The first sacking of Rome in 410 was relatively non-destructive and involved no major battles. The sacking of 455 by the Vandals was more destructive, but still far from a critical blow to the imperial government, which had been moved to Ravenna regardless in 402. Too much Christianity. The idea that Christianity is or was not compatible with a martial ethos might be argued against by looking at the aggressive conduct of medieval Christian states. But we don't even need to go that far, because we can still see in the ancient period when Heraclius utilised Christianity as a cohesive ideology to counter the conquests of the Persians and later the Muslims, that Christianity and militarism were not necessarily incompatible, and the central role of the military in Roman government and state puts paid to the idea that the empire was no longer warlike. Not enough ancient virtues. This is a moralising way of viewing a real issue, the unwillingness of Roman citizens to serve in the army during a period of great danger and low opportunity for reward. With little ready money to pay soldiers with, and a high chance of death or serious injury, it's not unreasonable that people would be reluctant to serve, and it had little to do with abstract concepts such as virtus and onos. Now, you might have noticed that I did not return to a couple of the issues raised in the first part. That is, weak emperors and the decline of the legions. That's because these two problems were real, and they were symptoms of greater systemic weaknesses and damage to the empire's structural integrity that caused Western Rome to slowly, not quickly however, decay over a period of nearly a century. What were these weaknesses, and what was this damage? Let's have a look at these systemic weaknesses and the decisive events that interacted with them in turn to produce the fall of the Roman Empire. There were a significant number of cracks in the structure of the Roman state, and one of the most important was insufficient income from taxation. The Roman Empire had always expended half or more of its tax income on its military, but by the late Empire, taxation income was less than it had been, while the military's needs were ever greater, and as a consequence of more intense pressures in the east against the Persians and along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The lack of tax income was due to multiple factors, including administrative inefficiencies, corruption, and particularly aristocratic tax evasion, which was empire-wide. The later Roman Empire was actually more sophisticated and efficient in an administrative sense than was the early empire, but this was not enough to counteract the inevitable corruption that came from delegating responsibilities for tax collection and an increasing tendency for the wealthiest men to shirk their financial responsibilities to the empire, whether by outright evasion or by applying for special tax-exempt status for short periods. This economic weakness made the military under-resourced, undermanned, and therefore vulnerable. Therefore, when the military suffered defeats, there were two major and immediate effects. The first was that the military would require great resources, possibly unavailable, to recover its losses, and the inability to do this in the aftermath of major defeats such as that at Adrianople in 378 meant that the military and the empire was increasingly vulnerable to further defeats. Again, military defeats resulted in loss of territory, which meant the loss of tax income from those areas. And finally, military defeat discredited the emperor, making civil strife, usurpers and pretenders more likely to appear, not only to challenge the incumbent emperor, but as a genuine attempt by armies and populations to find a leader that they felt could protect them. The ugly and cascading interaction of all these factors is self-evident. Economic weakness leading to military weakness, leading to military defeat, leading to civil strife, further military weakness, and loss of territory, and so further economic weakness, and so on. Now, let's have a look at the specific historical events that interacted with the factors I've just described to gradually erode the power of the Western Roman government. As I go through the following series of events, keep in mind the interaction of the factors I mentioned above. Economic weakness leading to military weakness, leading to military defeat and loss of territory, leading to civil strife, reduced income, and so even greater military weakness. Try to note how the events I will now describe feed into this cycle. 378 AD, the Battle of Adrianople. The Eastern Emperor Valens is killed and the elite Eastern Field Army totally destroyed, and so the Goths left mostly unchecked in the Balkans, though unable to take any major cities. A treaty was signed some years later, but by 395 relations deteriorated with the Goths again, culminating in the sack of Rome in 410. After Adrianople, these Goths were never brought totally under Roman control, despite strenuous but under-resourced efforts by the beleaguered Western army. 405 and 406 AD, Radagaisus, with a large force of so-called barbarians, crosses into Italy, rampaging for months until being destroyed in a battle with the Western Roman army. Major damage was done to Italy in this time, causing huge reductions in tax income in the area for years. Around the same time, a large group of Vandals, Suebi and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine and were resisted unsuccessfully by the Roman Foederati, the Franks, and spread out throughout Gaul, so that a huge part of Roman territory was lost. 407 to 410 AD. Roman forces at this time are withdrawn from Britain, no doubt a result of the dire situation in Gaul and northern Italy. 410, Rome is taken by the Goths, demonstrating that by this point the Roman army struggled to confront the powerful Gothic confederation even in its own heartland. By 409, the Vandals and the Suebi reached Spain. In 412, the Visigoths established themselves in southern Gaul, and were formally accepted in the region around 418 to serve the Romans. We can therefore see further major dislocations of the Roman tax base, and the Romans being forced to come to terms with these powerful barbarian presences inside their territory. In 429, the Vandals, despite Roman opposition, crossed to Africa, and by 439 they took Carthage, the most powerful city of Africa, taking about a third of the Western Empire's remaining tax income with it. This gave them control of much of Rome's grain supply, as well as huge naval power in the Mediterranean, which they used energetically to raid Roman territory and added to the Roman headaches. By the end of the 440s, Roman alliances were formed with the Vandals and the Suebi in Galicia, the Alans in Valence and Gallia Ulterior, and the Burgundians in Savoy, but these territories were not returned to government control. Again, we see the Romans being forced to come to terms with permanent barbarian presences in these areas. In 452, the famous Attila the Hun invades and is barely defeated by a coalition with only a small Roman corps driven back from Rome by malaria, and he dies in 453. The Hunnic Empire collapses before long, but he caused enormous damage to the remnants of the Roman army. 455, the Vandals properly sack Rome. We can see from this how far Roman naval control of the Mediterranean has decayed. This was an enormous moral blow to the entire Roman Empire. There were a series of unsuccessful counterattacks on the Vandals, and the final and largest attack was in 468. It involved 1,100 ships and cost the Romans £64,000 of gold and £700,000 of silver. The fleet was damaged in a surprise attack by the Vandals and was unable to land, making the entire expedition an enormous and costly failure. By the 470s, only Italy was under the direct control of the Western Roman government. As the government became weaker, the benefits of serving them became less apparent, and groups such as the Visigoths, the Burgundians, began to operate increasingly independently. 475, the final attempt at a Roman comeback. The Roman Emperor Julius Nepos tries to take control of Gaul, but is betrayed by his Praetorian prefect, a man named Orestes, who named his own son Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus, as emperor. But the leader of Orestes' barbarian forces, Odoacer, pulled down the curtains on the empire and took control of Italy himself, ending even the impression of Western Roman rule. To sum all of this up, the dire combination of military vulnerability and economic weakness, leading to occasional heavy defeats, resultant civil strife and further loss of income, interacted catastrophically with intense military pressures, particularly from Adrianople onwards, to place the Western Empire in a gradually worse position and with less and less resources with which to recover. In the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was still very powerful. Despite its structural vulnerabilities, its fall was not inevitable in the foreseeable future. However, as a result of a series of major invasions in the first decade of the 5th century, by around 410, Roman military strength had probably been reduced by about half. With the loss of Carthage in 439, the majority of the Western Empire's income was lost. By the 440s, Rome was only one of several major powers in the region, including the Huns and the Vandals. A recovery under these circumstances was only possible with the recapture of Africa and its enormous tax base, but the massive failed expedition of 468 saw the end of such hopes. Still, it is notable that only a few years before the date traditionally recognised as Rome's fall, the empire was still capable of major military expeditions. The empire campaigned energetically in Gaul and Spain and did score some successes in this time. We might note that the empire was still capable of forging alliances such as with the Franks and even the Goths. It was evidently still a respected power. The Roman army was, after everything that had happened, still a capable force, and remained so until very late in the hour. For all the preceding criticisms of Rome, such as barbarianisation and corruption, etc., it is unlikely that under the circumstances any other empire could have survived these pressures. It is honestly a surprise that the Western government lasted as long as it did. Of course, the Eastern Empire survived intact and maintained its strength until the Persian and then the Arab conquests of the late 6th to the mid 7th centuries, but that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching, please let me know what you think and be sure to subscribe. Check out my other videos and keep an eye out for more content coming soon. Until next time, valete commilites.